thought I'd try something a little different today, and maybe in the coming days. It's a nice day, so I thought I might do some reflections as I walk around instead of in the chapel. Indeed, as many people have said, there's a need to get off the quarantine 15. That's the pounds that you put on as a result of staying home. But so we'll give this a shot and see what happens. But today in our readings, we get to reflect on the martyrdom of Saint Stephen. Saint Stephen was the first class of the people ordained as deacons, the men in the church who were ordained to help out the poor and the widows and the orphans, all the people that were in need that the church helped out. But they needed the deacons to assist in the distribution of those resources, to decide who needed the money and where their resources, their food should go. And so the deacons were instrumental in the life of the early church, and some of the earliest martyrs that we have are deacons, and indeed that's true of Saint Stephen, to whom we give the name the proto-martyr, the very first martyr of the church. And so today we hear how Saint Stephen has false accusations brought against him. Much like Christ, Saint Stephen is accused of wanting to tear down the temple, of tearing down the things that the Jewish faith has built up, that all the things that the Jewish faith, that the Jewish leaders have striven to work for, that St. Stephen wants to tear down. And of course, those are ridiculous claims. But St. Stephen is nevertheless found guilty of them. And so he's stoned to death. And yet we see how St. Stephen sees in his own death an imitation of the death of Christ. We see this in two particular ways. We see how St. Stephen, when he suffers, he first of all repeats twice the words that the Lord said on the cross. Our Lord said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." And indeed, even as St. Stephen dies, he says, "Father, God, forgive them. These are people that are unaware of what they're doing." So St. Stephen repeats that word of Christ. And Jesus also on the cross says, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." And we see St. Stephen give that same response. "God, into your hands I commend my soul. I commend my soul to you." And so we see how St. Stephen is imitating our Lord, how he's imitating him in his passion. Hello. And so we can see how St. Stephen sees in his own death an imitation of Christ's death, an imitation of the passion of Christ. And so too, we're called to do the same thing. We're called to see in our own sufferings, whether they be physical or emotional, psychological, especially at this point in time, that we're meant to see in our sufferings a joining of our death with Christ. A joining of our little deaths, the little things that we experience, with the sufferings of Christ. St. Paul says we make up for what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. So Christ's death accomplished the salvation of the world, and so in our little deaths, we can imitate the salvation of the world that God wanted to accomplish in us. And so we can seek to be agents of accomplishing that grace in our world today. It's also of worthy note that in the first part of Acts, we've begun to look at St. Peter. St. Peter, who is the patron saint, of course, of our parish, and who's a prominent figure in the first part of the Acts of the Apostles. But now we begin to turn to St. Paul, and we see when Stephen is sown that the very last line of our reading is, "And St. Paul looked on approvingly." That St. Paul approved of what was happening to St. Stephen. And so we can see how even God is going to bring good out of St. Paul. Even St. Paul, who was somebody who approved of the murders of St. Stephen, who approved of who was not a good man. I mean, I'd say a murderer, but at least an accomplice to the murder of Stephen. And yet St. Paul will be a great example for us. And so we'll follow the adventures of St. Paul in the days to come.